Good morning, everyone. I'm Judy Kelly. I'm Dean of the Sanford School of Public Policy, and I'm so delighted to welcome you all to today's conversation between Judy Woodruff and David Price, a career in service. And I am so honored to have these two people join us today because they are both beloved members of the Duke and Sanford community and such outstanding examples of careers in public service. For so long, David has been serving our country in the Congress, and every night you can turn on your television and there Judy will be no matter what. And such stalwarts, and such a pleasure to have a conversation between the two of them today. I should also mention that we are celebrating 50 years of public policy at the Sanford School here at Duke University. And so we are especially happy to be able to have this event in that context as well. Without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Deandra Rose, who's the director of Polis. She'll introduce our guests. Deandra.
Thank you so much, Judith, and good morning, everyone. On behalf of Polis, the Center for Politics, and the Duke and DC teams, it is a privilege to welcome you to today's conversation. I also want to echo Dean Kelly's thanks to Congressman Price and Ms. Woodruff for headlining this very special conversation. Polis's theme this year is Discourse for Democracy. And in their work in politics and journalism, respectively, our guests exemplify the values of open discussion, active listening, and thoughtful debate that are crucial for combating the division and polarization that have come to characterize and dominate our political landscape. To offer a very quick overview of today's program, the first 45 minutes or so will be a conversation between Congressman Price and Ms. Woodruff. Then Judy will turn it over to questions from you, our wonderful audience. Thank you so much for submitting questions in the registration portal. So Judy has those questions and she will turn to those later in the program. I'm pleased to introduce Congressman David Price, who represents North Carolina's 4th District, a rapidly growing research and education-focused district that includes Durham, Franklin, Granville, and Orange counties, as well as parts of Chatham, Wake, and Vance counties. He received his undergraduate degree at UNC Chapel Hill and went on to Yale University to earn a Bachelor of Divinity and also a PhD in political science. Before he began serving in Congress in 1987, Mr. Price was a professor of political science and public policy right here at Duke University. He's the author of 4 books on Congress and the American political system, so many of you might notice this or recognize this book. And Mr. Price currently serves on the House Appropriations Committee and is the chairman of the Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Appropriations Subcommittee. He also serves on the House Budget Committee and is a member of the Appropriations Subcommittees on Homeland Security, State Department, and Foreign Operations. He's a recognized leader in foreign policy, serving as chairman of the House Democracy Partnership, which he initiated to help strengthen parliaments in emerging democracies. Here in North Carolina, David's constituents know him as a strong supporter of education, accessible healthcare, affordable housing, clean air and water, and improved transportation alternatives. Our special moderator for today is broadcast journalist and Duke University trustee emerita Judy Woodruff from the class of 1968. Ms. Woodruff is the anchor and managing editor of the PBS NewsHour. She's covered politics and other news for 5 decades at NBC, CNN, and PBS. At NBC News, she was the White House correspondent was a White House correspondent from 1977 to 1982. For 1 year after that, she served as NBC Today Show's chief Washington correspondent. At CNN, she served as anchor and senior correspondent for 12 years. Among other duties, she anchored the weekday program, Inside Politics. She returned to the NewsHour in 2007, and in 2013, she and the late Gwen Ifill were named the first 2 women to co-anchor a national news broadcast. After Ms. Ifill's death, Ms. Woodruff was named the sole anchor. At PBS, she was the chief Washington correspondent for the MacNeil-Lehrer NewsHour. She's also anchored PBS's award-winning documentary series, Frontline with Judy Woodruff. Among her many awards and honors, Judy is the recipient of the Radcliffe Medal, the Poynter Medal for Lifetime Achievement in Journalism, the Gwen Ifill Press Freedom Award from the Committee to Protect Journalists, and the Cronkite Award for Excellence in Journalism. She's also the recipient of the Duke University Distinguished Alumni Award. David and Judy, welcome, and thank you again for giving us this opportunity to learn from you today. Judy, I'm delighted to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Deandra, and thank you, Dean Kelly, for the honor of moderating this conversation. I'm thrilled to have this chance to be here with Congressman Price, one of the most respected members of the United States Congress. We are 6 feet away from each other at the Duke Center here in Washington, and it's just a treat for me. This is a man who knows this city as well as, if not better than any other member of Congress. That's why it's terrific to have this chance to talk to him about his experiences in Congress. I think, as all of you know, he graduated from the University of North Carolina, went on to Yale, earned a divinity degree, PhD, then came to Duke to start the Sanford School, and then began to think about a career in politics. And we're going to talk about that. Congressman, hello. It's good to see you in person, even though we are 6 feet appropriately away from each other, and
Great.
the room is almost empty.
Yeah, that's not what we're used to here at the Rubenstein Center, Duke's home in Washington. But I'm very happy to be here and appreciate the chance to talk with you.
Well, I want to start. There's so much to talk to you about. There's a lot going on in Congress right now. We were just chatting about it, but I want to start with those years when you were at Duke in the 1970s, and then the early 80s. And at some point, you decided to move from an academic career. You'd begun to get involved in politics. You'd run a couple of campaigns and been very involved in chairing the Democratic Party in North Carolina. What was it about teaching that lent itself to a career in politics? And what was it about politics that you think informed your love for teaching?
Well, I was part of that young group who, under Joel Fleischman's leadership, launched what's now the Sanford School of Public Policy. We're very proud of that and proud of this 50th year anniversary. So I do, that's what lured me back to North Carolina. I had grown up in a small town in East Tennessee, had come across the mountains to Mars Hill and then UNC. And when people ask me about my interest and engagement in politics, I almost always go back to that rather than to my first campaign, because it was that period when the civil rights movement was sweeping across the South, the sit-ins, what one learned off campus was just important as what one learned on campus. And the views we had grown up with, political, religious, social views, were shaken up. And it wasn't too long after that I went on to graduate school. I worked summers in Washington on a Senate staff. And I remember being in the Senate gallery when the Civil Rights Bill was passed and the filibuster was broken on that legislation.
1965.
Yes, well, 64 for the Civil Rights Act.
Oh, you're right.
65 for voting rights. So
You're right,
so someone who lived through that and got caught up in that, and many in our generation did, you're never going to take politics lightly. You're never going to just make cheap shots at government. We have an understanding, and it's stayed with me the rest of my life, that if things are going to change, if ancient wrongs are going to be righted, it's going to take politics and it's going to take government. And so I think the die was cast then that whatever I did in my life, I was always going to be attentive to these things. I did not think, though, when I came back to North Carolina and Duke in 1973 that 14 years later I would be in the Congress. I wouldn't have expected that. But you're right. I did get involved in a number of campaigns. Jim Hunt recruited me to lead the state Democratic Party in 1980 and 1984. His epic race with Jesse Helms for the Senate. And I must say, though, that the encouragement from Duke, I don't think the Sanford School founders necessarily thought their faculty would run for Congress. On the other hand, there was an active encouragement of civic engagement, and I guess I did that to a fault.
And when you came to Washington, it was 1987. It was the end of the Reagan administration. It was a time you thought of possibility, a time when you felt you could make a difference. Can you give us a sense of what that felt like then, in that period, the late 80s, the early 90s? And of course, in a minute, we're going to talk about how it's changed, because it has changed, and you've done 4 editions of your book to reflect that. But give us a sense of what the sense of possibility was then.
Well, it was very exciting, of course, to be elected to the Congress, a dream that I had never thought would ever come true. And here I was, 1987. The Reagan administration had a body blow with the Iran-Contra scandal, and was a diminished force. And we had a hard-charging new Speaker of the House named Jim Wright, who would become a target for Newt Gingrich and would fall within 3 years. But at that point, Jim Wright came in, big agenda. Congress is going to take the lead on a whole range of things. I remember 2 of those items were aid to education and transportation. I remember transportation in particular. These were bipartisan issues. I couldn't get to the floor fast enough to overturn Reagan's veto of the big infrastructure bill in 1987. So there was a sense that we were driving the train, and there was, and as you say, part of this was the environment of Congress itself. We were past the days of the Southern segregationist chairman that stayed there forever. The Democratic Party was more of a unified party. People like myself coming from the South were mainstream Democrats, and and it was a place where committees were very strong, where a member could carve out a few areas like I did, and work often on a bipartisan basis to get things. A bill becomes a law, just like the civics book has it. Well, that has changed, but it certainly was interesting to come in at that point, and I got a pretty rough education along the way. Politics in North Carolina, Jesse Helms and the politics of the Congressional Club was already setting the tone. So I'm not saying it was a picnic, but certainly within the Congress, the ways we could work through the committees across party lines was much easier.
The way you write about the Congress, Congressman Price, I think this book should be a primer for everybody who serves in the Congress, because you walk us through what it's like to figure out what committee you're going to serve on, to figure out, how can you get the things done that you want to get done, your relationships, there's just so much in this book that's basic information, I would think. And yet it has changed over the years. I mean, one of the great themes of the book is you've moved from the committees having a lot of influence, and of course they still have a great deal, to this, what you call the centralization of power. Speak about how that's changed, how power has become much more centralized in Congress today.
The watershed event on this question, and just also, I think, on the atmospherics of the Congress was Newt Gingrich coming to power. That was significant. We realized at the time, but maybe not how significant, because when he defeated a more moderate member, and then engineered the fall of Speaker Wright, and led up to the '94 election, the Gingrich Revolution, which I lost my seat in, and the leadership of the House turned over the first time in decades. That really did change things. That was, and along the lines of centralization, it changed that too, because once Newt Gingrich became Speaker, you hadn't had that centralized an institution since Uncle Joe Cannon a century earlier. It was extraordinary how much power then went into the Speaker's hands. So fast forward to 2007, Democrats back in leadership. Nancy Pelosi wasn't about to go back to the days where Dan Rostenkowski and John Dingell ruled the roost, and we didn't want her to. I mean, I'm not inclined to romanticize those years when I first came in.
These are committee chairs.
The powerful committee chairs. And I would say that the House had become, it was very closely divided. Things were very contentious. Working with people across party lines was much harder. So the House needed stronger leadership. And then you add to that crisis after crisis. You know, crisis begets crisis. And if there's a government shutdown looming, then you're not going to turn to me, an appropriations subcommittee chairman, and say, go work it out. No, it's going to get jacked up to the leadership level, and it's going to have to be worked out in high-level negotiations. Pandemic, by the way, is has also added to that. But anyway, there are lots of things that are rooted, I think, in the sharper partisan divisions of the House, and in that precedent that Newt Gingrich set, which has to some extent influenced both parties. It is a more centralized place.
You make it pretty clear in the book that you think the responsibility for all this originally lies with the Republican Party, with Newt Gingrich, with what happened in the early 90s, what you call, I think maybe I use this term, it's not your abandoning the center, but you called it an asymmetrical polarization. Is that right? I mean, what role did the Democrats play, or was it principally the Republicans who abandoned the center?
Well, I should say that you know, the march towards centralization, what I document in the book, actually did start with Democrats, and it started with the attempt on the Democratic side to shed that segregationist past, to replace some of those chairmen who had been there forever through the 70s before I got there, to have a more responsible party, a party that was mainstream, a party that had a program, a party that could enact that program. And so leadership got strengthened through the 70s, and that's what Jim Wright was trying to carry forward when I got there. So that was mainly on the Democratic side that happened. It wasn't all about Newt Gingrich, although Gingrich took it to new heights, and I'd say a kind of arbitrary quality. But anyway, it is a modern trend that both parties share in. In terms of the atmosphere, no, we have excesses of partisanship all around. But when I say asymmetric, I'm actually borrowing that term from our friends Norm Ornstein and Tom Mann, who in their book, I think it's called "It's Even Worse Than It Looks" or something like that. It's an anguished cry from a couple of congressional scholars about what's happened to the institution, and they say this isn't just polarization. It is that. But it's a kind of asymmetrical movement in the sense that it is the Republican Party more than the Democrats who have gone off in a extreme ideological direction. And of course, we can now add to that with the Freedom Caucus's emergence. You know, Republicans are not as unified as they used to be. It's very hard to govern from the Republican side. John Boehner learned that. Paul Ryan learned that, and certainly Donald Trump made it worse. So Republican Party is more ideological and more extreme. I would say that that's a kind of a mixed bag, though, for centralization, because it's become a pretty hard party to manage.
What about the Democrats' role in that? You mentioned going back to the civil rights, the power that Southern members of Congress had. But what about today? The squad, the very vocal and determined progressives in the Democratic Party.
That's right. We have from the squad on the left to still Blue Dogs, as they call themselves, a caucus of more moderate to conservative members. So we're not a tight ship by any means. If you look at the distribution, though, and I have a chart in the book that shows this, if you look at the distribution, ideological distribution, we're not as spread out as the Republicans. And we certainly don't have as many members to our far left as they have to their far right. And but we have some challenges. They have been evident this year, and it's a question for us: how much should these caucuses? What kind of role should they play? The Progressive Caucus, the Blue Dogs, the various caucuses, ideological caucuses. You know, when the House is as closely divided as it is, and you've got big things you're trying to do, then unfortunately, a few members might decide, well, I'm going to get my way, or I'm going to bring it down. that is not that is not the way the House should run, and I really think in the end our caucuses have come around and understood the need for compromise. But it's hard. It's a challenge. Well, they certainly did with respect to the passage finally of the big infrastructure bill, the bipartisan infrastructure bill.
Right.
If I'd had my way, we would have done that several weeks earlier, however.
Several weeks earlier. There's so much to ask you about polarization and about figures in Congress you've worked with. But I do want to ask you, Congressman Price, about, I mean, you have found a way to be part of the process and to work on issues that matter to you. You early on, you were part of the Appropriations Committee. You talked about the decision to run for that. I mean, to go after it. And that's been an important part of your career and your contribution. Tell us why that part of Congress has mattered so much to you, and why you think it has made the contribution that you wanted, that you originally wanted.
Well, that's true, and that does suggest a caveat to what I said earlier about how centralized and regimented it's gotten. It's still, when you compare our Congress, our House, to most parliaments in the world, it's still a place where an ambitious entrepreneurial member can carve out a role, can make a mark. It's harder now, but it still has that potential. And then, as you're suggesting, within the House, it's not all just what you see on C-SPAN. There is a difference still in the way different committees operate, and I have fortunately been in two leadership roles, both of which are, as things go these days, remarkably bipartisan. I've partly chosen that. I've partly, I guess, just been fortunate. Well, in one case, we deliberately have insisted on it, and that is the House Democracy Partnership, the bipartisan commission that I initiated now 16 years ago, to engage member to member, staff to staff with parliaments in developing countries. We've kept that resolutely
around the world.
And we've kept that resolutely nonpartisan. And successive Republican leaders, David Dreyer, Peter Roskam, Vern Buchanan, have shared that fully. So we've insisted on that. It's the most bipartisan thing I do. But as you say, appropriations still has some of that too. Appropriations history is as the embodiment of the power of the purse, our main constitutional power. That's an institutional power. It's not a partisan power. And so there historically has been a sense that the Appropriations Committee spoke for the House. And members who have aspired to appropriations have been pretty much institutionally minded members. Now, some of that has deteriorated, but I'd still say that it has some of that character. And certainly my partner there, Mario Diaz-Balart of Florida, Republican of Florida, he was chairman, I was ranking, then vice versa. And we have worked very cooperatively to write these bills. Now, sometimes we get swamped. You know, right now, and we're in a situation where we're trying to get our bill, the bill we wrote cooperatively, trying to get that bill passed as part of an omnibus. And that's being negotiated at those top levels, but still that bill is intact. And so there still are some rewards and possibilities for bipartisan cooperation.
Do you think the most important and lasting things you've been able to do as a member of Congress were, frankly, because you were a Democrat working with a Democratic majority, or because you were able to work with the other party?
Well, there's some things on both sides of that ledger, I would say. I mean, honestly, the most productive times for me as a part of the Democratic team have been those times when we were able to get a program enacted kind of in the old responsible party mold. The first 2 years of Clinton's administration, the first 2 years of Obama's administration, and now we're hoping to. Well, we've got a pretty good record here so far with Biden, but we still have some distance to go. But those have been very rewarding times, and I've participated in that, but as a team member, and that I think counts as a successful time. Trouble is, it doesn't happen too often. and it's hard to sustain. There are other times when I think bipartisan cooperation has paid off pretty richly for me. The founding of the House Democracy Partnership was done with a Republican speaker who we managed to persuade to get that going. The biggest project I've done in my district, this world-class Environmental Protection Agency lab in Research Triangle, that I am very, very much indebted to some Republican leaders without whom that would not have happened.
And yet today, it looks to the American people as if Congress, the two parties are at each other's throats. Is that an accurate perception of Congress right now? Or is there just a whole lot more going on behind the scenes that we don't see?
There are some things going on behind the scenes that are encouraging, and I've named a couple of them. But the overall sense that this is an institution that's just really damaged by partisanship and a pretty extreme brand of partisanship, I think, more on one side than the other. I think that's accurate, and I'm concerned about it at this moment. And this is since the book was written. I wrote a lot about the Trump administration and what Donald Trump had meant for the Republican Party in the book, but I could not have dreamed of what happened on January 6th. And I did think this. I thought that for a long time, my Republican colleagues were afraid of getting picked off one at a time. You know, they knew the Republican base was supportive of Trump. They were wary that if they stepped out, they would get cut off. And so I thought, what is needed here is a critical mass, is for a group of elders to go down to the White House and have a talk, or at the point of the insurrection, for leaders like McConnell, like Liz Cheney, to speak out, and finally then the critical mass forms to resist this, and that has not happened. That is a major problem, I think.
Why do you think that? Excuse me. Why do you think that has not happened?
I think it's probably that that sense that one would get picked off one at a time hasn't been overcome, even though you would think Mitch McConnell would be pretty good cover, right? But the Republican base, you know, this has never been just driven from the Congress or even from Trump. I mean, the Republican base has gone off in a very extreme direction, and for whatever reasons are still wedded, very much wedded, maybe even more so than a year ago, to Donald Trump. And so essentially, I think Republicans fear being picked off, being victimized. Some of them are retiring. Some of the ones who voted for the richly deserved second impeachment have one by one retired. It's I did not expect that, and I'm alarmed by it.
Do you talk privately with Republican members who share their own fears? I mean, is it your sense that privately they have concerns that they're not sharing publicly? Or, I mean, is what we see what we get?
No, I think it's mixed, and I don't talk to all Republicans, of course. I have a selective sample, I suppose, from our North Carolina group and people who have been around a while longer. And one question I raised about a very extreme member with a Republican colleague, the response basically was, well, our base loves it. Our base loves this stuff. And that is kind of an all-purpose explanation. I don't think it's good enough, not by any means. And I sometimes ask myself, what if George Wallace had prevailed in the Democratic Party? Or what if the Democratic Party had taken a deviant turn? Would we have had the wherewithal, people like myself, to have blown the whistle, to have resisted? I hope we would have. But I do think it's not happening on the Republican side, and that therefore we're in a perilous moment.
It's interesting. You said a moment ago, I was interested, you said that it's partly former President Trump, but it's the base. To what extent is President Trump driving this, do you think?
Well, I think he's certainly the driving force, and the base's loyalty to him, personal loyalty to him, has added a whole new element to this. One of the things I do talk about in the book, though, is how there were a lot of precursors on the Republican side to the Trump phenomenon, going back to Richard Nixon's Southern strategy, going back to some elements of George W. Bush's unilateral foreign policy, some of the dog whistles about immigration that we've heard for many years. Those things didn't all start with Donald Trump, but he certainly picked up on them and gave them a kind of personal force that has proved to be very hard to shake.
Do you, I mean, what is your sense of how we get through, how the country gets through this? And do you see working together as a goal, or overwhelming as a goal? I mean, what do you see as what the country should be working on right now?
Well, somebody asking that question, just encountering what I wrote, would say perhaps that I'm not totally consistent, but I'll just say the answers don't all lie in the same realm. I think in politics, sometimes you just need to win an election, particularly when the differences are as great as there are right now, and the possibilities for a creative compromise are so low. You just need to forge ahead. You know, we say compromise where you can, cooperate where you can, fight where you must. Well, there's a lot in that fight where you must category these days. So I think we do need to fight. We need to do the very best we can, and then we need to win elections. Having said that, there are choices that we have to make in the day-to-day operation of our institution. Some of them have to do with what I described earlier about, you know, do you find a basis for cooperation on writing an appropriations bill, or do you just fan the flames? And I think often the decision needs to be that you find some basis for cooperation. And then I would say also, and this has been a theme in this book since the first edition, although I could hardly have known how important it would seem to me later. You know, we need to be good institutional citizens, and this applies to members of both parties. You know, there's a bias in American history, what I call the kind of Lone Ranger ethical bias, that you show how virtuous you are, you show what a strong leader you are by declaring your independence of institutions. You're independent of your party. You're independent of those other bandits in the Congress. You're the only righteous person there. Richard Fenno said years ago, people run for Congress by running against Congress. Well, there's a problem with that when the Congress needs to function. Congress bleeds from thousands of cuts. And the idea, I think, at some point needs to be my responsibility for enabling my committee or my party or my institution to function. That is just as compelling as my responsibility to show how independent I am. And how I'm going to hold out for every last thing that I'm demanding. I don't think that's the essence of being moral or ethical, to be the Lone Ranger. You know, we need members who have that kind of institutional patriotism. That's not being uncritical. You know, I'm not saying that. Of course, you're critical of the institution. You want to reform it. You want to make it better. But neither can you simply declare your independence of the institution.
But we've seen candidates over the years run for president, running against the Congress, run for office, want to come to Congress to clean up Congress, fix Congress. Congress has taken a beating. Washington, people who work in Washington, people who work for the federal government continue to take a beating. The public view is as low as I think it's ever been, and it's always been. It's been low. It's interesting to hear you say that it's time to stand up for the institution. There aren't many voices doing that right now.
No, but there are people who, one way or another, I think appreciate what I'm talking about and are trying to make the institution work. You know, one place each year I can count on seeing you is the Sammys Awards. The Partnership for Public Service puts on an award, and the founder of the Sanford School, Joel Fleischman, is always a part of that. Well, what do the Sammys do? The Sammys reward just extremely inspiring accounts of public service. People throughout the bureaucracy, unseen bureaucrats. By the way, they take a beating too. You know, it's not much kind of general ego to be had in being a bureaucrat, but bureaucrats do essential things, and so the PPS does highlight that. So yeah, the need in our institution for that kind of you know, I think I remember Bill Coffin, the chaplain at Yale, once said, you know, there are three kinds of patriotism in this world. There's the uncritical lovers of a country. You don't need that. Nor do you need loveless critics. You need critical people who love their country and who express that love through trying to mend its flaws. I think that's true of our institutions. I think it is true of a lot of things in life, that we need to appreciate the past, appreciate the history, appreciate the legacy, but also understand that we've got to do better. But we don't do better simply by detaching ourselves and posing as the righteous outsider.
We have some wonderful questions from the participants, the people who are online with us. But I do want to ask you about what's going on right now before I turn to those, and that is this debate in the Senate over voting rights. It's the other body. The House has already voted to support voting rights legislation. It's, as you very well know, it's in the news this morning. Again, there aren't enough Democrats to support, you know, allowing it to pass by majority vote. They would require undoing the filibuster. What do you make of where we are on that issue and how it's been handled by the leadership, Democratic leadership?
We should be able to uphold voting rights in this country, as we did for many years with virtually unanimous support for the Voting Rights Act and for the procedures over at the Justice Department, whereby voting changes were scrutinized for a possible racial impact, for reasons that have a good deal to do, I think, with the rightward turn of the Republican Party, and that's become no longer a consensus. That's true of a lot of things, but it's certainly true of election reform and voting rights. It's no longer an area of bipartisan consensus. The old days of the McCain-Feingold reforms, both sides of the aisle, those are long past. So we need to be able to protect voting rights, and the threats have partly come from the courts. The Supreme Court landed a body blow when it removed those pre-clearance procedures, so-called, at the Justice Department. And now in state after state, Republicans are actually suppressing the vote and have calculated that they do better when fewer people vote, just to overgeneralize a bit, but not much. I mean, that's really what's going on. So the question is, how can we, and now you've added the element of Donald Trump and the question about whether state legislatures ought to be able to choose alternative electors and incredible things, which we never thought we'd have to deal with. So some legislation to deal with these things has been distilled, has been repassed by the House. And now the question is, does the Senate consider it? There's, of course, a 50-50 majority in the Senate, which is a tough situation for passing anything, because one member can stand in the way. It's better than being 50-50 the other way, but still it's tough. And we've experienced that fully. So now the issue is, could we, if all 50 of our members are for this, which they are, everyone is for this voting reform, can we pass it? And then you come up against the filibuster, which has become routine in the Senate. That's ahistorical, the notion this is a historically venerable institution. It isn't so. It has, in fact, a dishonorable past. There's no constitutional requirement for a supermajority requirement for votes in the Senate. And in fact, for most of its history, there was no such requirement. My first experience with the filibusters are recounted in the book. A very dramatic scene. I was a young seminary student working in Washington. I crowded into the Senate gallery. The vote to break the filibuster was held on the Civil Rights Bill of 1964. Claire Engel, a senator from California, 2 weeks away from death, was brought in on a stretcher. He was too weak to speak. When his name was called, he raised his finger. That's how the filibuster was broken. That's the history of the filibuster in the United States Senate. And so the notion that it's some kind of historically venerable institution is just wrong. So I really wish we could bring our remaining 2 members around and at least carve out an exception for the rules of the game, the democratic rules of the game, as voting rights surely is.
Why do you think, just in a word, Senators Manchin and Sinema will not bend on the filibuster? What's behind this?
I don't know. I can't venture even a short guess. I think with Manchin, there's some history, I guess, in terms of the southern states or border states backing the filibuster, but you know that that's not a particularly honorable history.
Again, great questions from participants, and I don't have a name to attach to these. My apologies. So you know who you are. Thank you for the questions. Congressman, here's one. What can we as normal people do to help save democracy from the issues that are plaguing it today? And I think a lot of it relates to what you were just saying about the election process.
I think there does need to be a much wider civic discourse. That's of course what Polis is up to. I'm glad to see the Duke Sanford School taking that on. I've long thought that the Sanford School needed an outward-facing organization like Polis, so I'm happy to encourage that. There needs to be this kind of discussion all over the place. There, I think, needs to be a conscious effort on the part of us in public office, in public life, to constantly mine this history, to interpret interpret what's at stake, to insist on the truth, and then people need to elect people committed to that enterprise of truth telling and protecting democracy. I don't know what else we can depend on in the end. If this country is in big trouble if large numbers of people, let alone a majority, accept anti-democratic views or conspiracy theories, it's just not going to work.
What is your fear that if I don't know, if Democrats lose the House and the Senate in 2022 and a Republican's elected in 2024, what is your fear? What's your concern?
My fear is that we could be in a world of trouble. Certainly, if that president is Donald Trump or someone committed to Trumpism. You asked earlier what needed to happen to correct things in the Congress. I think I started to say and went on, but the what happens to the Republican Party is really important, and we've talked about some of the ways it has not changed or that people have not risen to the occasion. This country needs a center-right conservative party, just like it needs a center-left party. This is a two-party system. We need two broadly based parties that play by the rules, that honor our history, but have very different views and debating. Are constantly debating on policy. Somehow we've got to get back to that. And it's never been perfect, but it's certainly been better than it is now. And I don't think there's any answer to your question that doesn't, to some extent, depend on what Republican leadership can manage.
Here's another question. If someone were to run for Congress today, what would your advice be to them? I'm sure you must have people coming to you who are either running or thinking about running. And what do you say to them?
Well, there are sections, as you said, in the book about the excitement of running that first time and
Right.
getting those radio ads that mention my name 30 times to get so somebody knew who the heck I was. I would, sure, they could look at the book and see what my.
Yeah, I remember one of them was, did you say Price?
Price, so people still to this day, people will say something like the price is right and think that I should find that clever, like I never heard that 30 years ago. Anyway, we played on the name mercilessly. But I would also say that the story there is not entirely accurate as to what it's like these days in terms of the money required, in terms of the, we were engaged in some pretty severe ideological warfare. A lot of Jesse Helms and his organization kind of set the pattern in North Carolina for very hard hitting ads. And so it was no picnic.
It was not all sweetness and light.
No, it wasn't, but it's worse now, I think. And certainly the money required is more now. And so I guess my advice, though, is still what it was to students years ago and what it was to myself years ago. And that is that if you aspire to a career in politics, don't conceive of that too narrowly. Don't don't deny yourself opportunities or I went through Carolina. You probably encountered similar fellow students. They were going to be governor of North Carolina someday. They were pretty sure of that. And they were going to be very single-minded about, never leaving the state, doing all the things right just to lead to that political goal. And that's of course not a good idea. Most of them are not going to be governor, and all of us need to have rewarding, satisfying careers. I think being active politically, being engaged politically is always a good idea. But one finds different ways of doing that. But that's what I would counsel, is to pay attention, to be involved, including on a local level, and then to be aware of opportunities to exercise leadership and perhaps to run for office yourself. But do not put all your eggs in that basket.
What is your, well, let me just back up on that just a minute. If somebody's thinking about running, do you say, go ahead and go for it? Congress is a great place to serve, or think twice about it? I mean, I know it differs with the individual and their circumstances, but.
Well, at some point, go for it. Sure. I mean, if this is what you want to do, if you've done your homework, if you've engaged at the community level, if you've got circles of friends and supporters, you don't just do this because you want to do it. You do it because you're in a situation to make a credible effort. But even then, it is a leap. It is a leap, and I have never done anything harder than trying to run in a competitive Democratic primary and raise money and kind of carve out my place initially.
But you've done it 17 times.
Well, it gets less hard, but I lost an election, and I had to think about, do I attempt a comeback? So it's not for the faint of heart, and you do have to at some point just make that leap. But you don't necessarily run for Congress first thing you do. You may run for another office. You may seek other lines of community service. There's just always a balance, I think, between what you really have a passion for and what you feel like you have a reasonable chance of achieving.
Here's another question. What's your best advice for creating a positive work environment with people who fundamentally disagree with you?
Well, I do think what we were saying earlier about the choices you make daily, even in a place where the U.S. House, where a lot of this is, you don't have always a choice as to what role you're going to play. You do have choices, And so if the question has to do with how, as a member of Congress, you can influence this, I think the kind of approach you take to your colleagues, the kind of balance you strike between that cooperate where you can, fight where you must. The trick, of course, is figuring out which is which. And I have found that there are often areas of common ground that I can find, and that it's personally satisfying and politically smart, I think, to do that. And despite the polarization, the House is still a place where you can do that.
There are some people you can work with.
Yes.
But there are also people where you can't.
There are people who and some of the members in more recent years have been more extreme in that regard. There's some people it's just very difficult to find common ground with, and you make an effort. I've made an effort, but at a certain point, you sometimes just have to move on, find out who you can work with, and try to put it together.
What does a typical workday for David Price look like?
I actually put that in the book. I put a daily schedule in the book.
Did.
I thought, well, that's probably something that I'll drop in this edition. But then some people who had used the book in teaching said the students like that, so I left it in there. It's very busy. It's first of all, your life is divided between life in the district and in Washington. It's approximately half and half. I have almost half my staff in the district. And so the life there is very different than it is here. And if you can't tolerate that, it's the wrong job for you. I mean, there are a lot of
changes.
The landscape is littered with people who either totally went Washington or totally went district. You got to do both. And there are satisfactions in both areas. But if you don't like talking to fifth graders, or if you don't like speaking to Rotary clubs, then it's probably not the job for you. You know, you do that. You need to enjoy that. You need to do it well. You need to use those occasions to interpret and reach out. And so in the district, there's business tours. We do dozens of those every year. We do civic clubs, the whole circuit of just reaching out, some of which you get invited to do, but most of which you have to create for yourself. Then in Washington, there is of course, a steady flow of business with people in North Carolina love to come to Washington. And I figured out over the years, you know, it's close enough to be fairly convenient, but far enough to be kind of an adventure. So they really like coming up here and don't want to just meet in the district. So we have all kinds of home builders and realtors and insurance agents and social workers, whoever it is, they're here in Washington. You spend a lot of time talking with those. My rule of thumb has always been that if a group has a constituent, they have every right to meet with me, and I will meet with them. And then as you go into leadership, like the House Democracy Partnership, my subcommittee, I find myself meeting with the Transit Authority of Fort Worth, or others with interest before my subcommittee, and certainly meeting with lots of ambassadors and foreign groups of parliamentarians. So it adds up to a very full and rich schedule.
Not much quiet time.
No.
What brings you the greatest joy about your work? What makes you smile in what you do?
I often feel very, very good about encounters I have in the district that are 5 years ago you got a immigration problem worked out. 8 years ago, I got my Social Security check straightened out. A lot of those things are very satisfying. I'll just tell you quickly. I often think about an encounter I had in Cary, North Carolina. I go door to door in non-campaign times as well as during the campaigns. And one hot Saturday morning, just very hot day, I came up to this fellow's house. There was a group of immigrant laborers across the street working to replace a roof. And this guy comes to the door, kind of central casting, t-shirt, gruff looking. He said to me, "Look over there. Look at those guys on that roof." I thought, oh no, here it comes. You know what he said? He said, why don't you think we can figure out a way to keep guys who work that hard staying in this country? I tell you, that made my day, if not my week. I mean, people will surprise you. And so there's a lot of that, of course, is very local, but you just have such rich interactions with people, not all of them pleasant, but enough pleasant to keep you going.
It's interesting you brought up immigration because I wanted to ask you about, there is another question here from a participant. I'd love to hear, they said, your reflections on immigration trends in North Carolina over the years from when you first served in Congress until now, and how could that shift the political, how is it, could it shift the political makeup of the state?
Well, that really is a good question. And whoever asked it knows that probably that the change has been pretty significant. When my wife Lisa and I returned to North Carolina, it wasn't, there was of course a large African-American population, but it was not an area known for its diversity. Now it is, and the Hispanic population has increased something like tenfold in our area. There are large populations of Asians, Indians, other South Asians, Chinese Americans. These are these are often people who have been attracted by high-tech jobs, and they have maybe come to study and have stayed. We need to make sure more of them can stay. So yes, that has changed. I pay a lot of attention. I, for example, became a member of the Indian caucus here, inaugurated a parliamentary exchange with the Indian Parliament. It's encouraged me in many ways to be more involved in foreign policy, to be bolder in that. It's also, I would say, brought a more progressive political cast to the district. Not all these folks, of course, are committed Democrats, but they do tend to be well-educated, attentive groups who support progressive politics by and large.
So many great questions here, but we're almost out of time, and I have a lot more questions, but I'm just going to close out with one of the questions one of our participants submitted as we wrap it up, and that is, what do you see yourself doing after you leave Congress? Is politics going to be part of what you do, public service, or are you going to transition to something else?
I haven't sufficiently thought about that yet. I still have a year to go here with a lot of things that I want to accomplish in terms of leaving the interparliamentary work in a strong position, getting some benchmarks laid for transportation and housing support that I think we can do this year. So I've got a full agenda. I returned to teaching when I lost the election in '94 and enjoyed that. I might do some of that, maybe on a kind of informal schedule. I don't know. There may be another writing project. I don't know. I will stay active. I will not stay as active as that packed schedule suggests, but I think it's it's going to be a big change. I know that, and but we'll find out. I hope some way to stay in the game.
Well, I know a lot of people certainly hope that's the case. Congressman David Price, thank you. What an honor to have this conversation with you. Thank you. And I think we want to go back to you, Deandra.
Thank you so very much. Judy, I don't know if you two could see the numbers of attendees here in the Zoom, but during the session, there were more than 100 students, faculty, staff, alumni, and friends joining us for the live stream today. On behalf of Duke University, the Sanford School of Public Policy, Duke and DC, and Polis, the Center for Politics, I'd like to offer our sincere thanks to Congressman David Price and Judy Woodruff for taking time to be with us today and for this masterclass in leadership and public service. I'd also like to thank their wonderful teams for helping us prepare for today. Polis is extremely grateful to the extraordinary Duke and DC DC team for partnering with us on this event and for hosting our guests in the Duke and DC office. Thanks so much, Jeff Harris, Louise Meyer, Eric Shipley, Lizzie Devitt. We're grateful to Rashid Willis and his team for exceptional AV support that made this live stream possible. And I want to give a special shout out to the Polis team, Meg Biddle, Braden Hammond, and our Polis Directors Fellows, James Gao, Hannah Stepnick, and Violet Wang for all of their work. A very deep thank you to everyone for taking time to join us today. If you like today's conversation, we hope you'll check out polis.duke.edu to learn more about Polis and our upcoming events and programs. Thanks so much for joining us, and we send you warm wishes for the rest of your day. Take care, everybody.